Thank you, Sally, and thanks very much for the invitation to address you this morning. The title of this seminar is Combating Hate Speech in Print and Broadcasting Media. And I think it's a very appropriate subject to address at this time, because if you leave hate speech unchallenged, you are losing. Hate speech has to be challenged at every possible opportunity. But we have to start by recognizing that there's a tension between the rights of freedom of expression and the abuse of that right. And that fundamental tension is central to all our considerations. In a democracy, we are entitled to express our views, and it is terribly important that we do so, and it's terribly important that journalists and the media in general feel they can do so, and also that they can provide space for the public, the citizen, to express his or her views. So we have to find a balance between protecting the freedom of expression, which is central to democracy, but also protecting citizens from actions which damage the public good and impinge upon the well-being of individual citizens. So there's no easy answer. There is always a balance between freedom of expression and the abuse of that right. And we must keep that to the forefront. And simplistic solutions can drive us in the direction of censorship, which potentially are as harmful or more harmful than actually allowing a certain license to people to express views which can be detrimental to the good of society. So what do you do if you find in an Irish newspaper or magazine examples of hate speech? Well, if what is published is on the margins, if you think there is space there to engage, if you think there is the possibility of a rational debate, if you think you can actually engage with that expression, my advice always is go for it. Try to engage. If what is published is simply beyond the pale, if it is just straightforward racism, straightforward hatred of minorities, then it's quite clear there isn't going to be any rational debate, and there isn't much point in trying to engage. If you decide it is the latter, then the code for the Press Council of Ireland, Principle 8, and I'll just read it out to you. The press shall not publish material intended to or likely to cause grave offence or stir up hatred against an individual or group on the basis of their race, their religion, their nationality, their colour, their ethnic origin, membership of the travelling community, their gender, their sexual orientation, their marital status, their disability or their age. That's a very strong principle. And if, in your opinion, you see something published in a newspaper or magazine which does, in your view, cause grave offence or stir up hatred, make a complaint to the Press Council of Ireland and it'll be investigated. The editors and journalists of every national paper in Ireland have signed up to the Code of Practice. The Code of Practice was drafted by journalists. It's an independent code, it's a journalist's code. It used to be called the Editor's Code at one stage. So they've signed up to a best practice, and therefore they should be held to account for it. If a complaint is made and it is upheld, the newspaper or magazine has to publish in full, with due prominence, the decision of the Press Ombudsman. That can mean a half page on page 4 of the newspaper, where there will be very strong criticism of the newspaper what is published. So it's quite a deterrent. I think what it does is it focuses the minds of editors on the possibility that they will be forced to acknowledge significant weaknesses in their editorial stewardship if they publish material which is considered a breach of Principle 8. But before you reach that point of the Press Ombudsman making a formal decision, the Press Council of Ireland has a conciliation process. And this is very important. An editor knows that if a complaint is upheld, he or she has to publish a decision. So they are prepared to focus on trying to resolve that complaint. So we have a case officer, and her job is to try to achieve a conciliated outcome, a successful outcome. So editors will perhaps offer you a right of reply. It may be a letter published, it may even be an editorial opinion piece. It's a good opportunity, not to be lost, to try and get a response from the newspaper which gives you space to express your views. So I'd strongly encourage anybody who believes that Principle 8 has been breached to contact the Press Council, and the Press Council will try to have a conciliated resolution first. My experience is that most editors in Ireland are quite open to engaging with their readers, that they seek where possible to address their readers' concerns. So my advice is to engage, don't be passive. Don't assume your voice won't be heard. And journalists need to hear alternative viewpoints. Roisin mentioned there that there is a danger, an echo chamber amongst journalists. They only hear their own viewpoints because they socialize together, they work together. It's actually terribly important to pull them up and say, hold on, listen to me, listen to my story. Because there's such a diversity of experience and diversity of stories that journalists can't be aware of all that is there. And it is so easy in any society not to listen. It's so easy in any society to ignore the problems that are there. Now, of course, editors may decide to defend what they've published. Because, after all, most of the potential for hate speech or racist speech or speech that discriminates against travellers or people because of their sexual orientation or whatever is actually found in opinion pieces. And there is a fair degree of latitude in opinion pieces. After all, it is just the opinion of the writer. An editor may well take the view, and that is that simply this is a contribution to a debate. It is, albeit a strongly worded viewpoint, it's only a viewpoint. And for the Press Ombudsman to find against that is effectively a form of censorship. And this is frequently the response an editor will make. But if that is the decision of the editor to defend what has been published, then I think he or she is leaving themselves open to say, right, well, give us a right of reply then. Allow us to challenge those views. So if somebody writes a piece about travellers and says they're all lazy, they all drink too much, etc., then there is a responsibility on the editor to go to traveller groups, or let traveller groups come to the editor to say, I want to respond to that. And a lot of the time, my office isn't engaged in trying to get formal decisions published upholding or not upholding complaints. It is trying to conciliate a resolution, and that frequently involves an agreement to publish a clarification, publish a correction, to publish a letter, or to allow an editorial piece in response. Editors will also say, and they use this tactic frequently, that if the Press Ombudsman upholds a complaint about an opinion piece, that there's the chilling fear of censorship about it, that you're actually inhibiting freedom of speech. And this is a defense they frequently will use. So there are two other principles that I think you should also consider if you see something in a newspaper or magazine which is offensive. The first of these is principle one. And principle one is a very simple principle, and it's common to almost every other press council in Europe and the world. In reporting news and information, the press shall strive at all times for truth and accuracy. So if there's something in an editorial piece which is inaccurate, Roisin talked about hordes of immigrants, floods of immigrants. If you can actually say, hold on a second, that's not true. There has been 100,000 immigrants, whatever the figure happens to be. Let's get the facts right first. If what you see in hate speech is inaccurate, it's actually easier to complain about a breach of inaccuracy than it is to complain about causing grave offence. So my advice to any group is, if there's something inaccurate, make a complaint on the basis of principle one, that something inaccurate has been published and the publication is obliged to publish the correction. There's also principle two, which is worth considering. Principle two, again, it's a simple one. Comment, conjecture, rumour and unconfirmed reports shall not be reported as fact. there's a lot of time when journalists confuse comment with fact. Facts are empirical. They can be confirmed or not confirmed. You can say, yes, that is accurate, no, it is not accurate. Comment, on the other hand, essentially is opinion. And there's a very easy move from fact into opinion. And Irish newspapers, if I'm critical of them, they have slipped somewhat, I think, in differentiating between the front page, which has facts, this is what happened in the world yesterday, and inside opinion pieces which are a reflection on those facts. I think trying to keep fact and commentary as separate as possible is quite important. But we live in an age in which celebrity sells, and reporters with a reputation or journalist reputation, they make their reputation largely in their opinion pieces rather than in their factual reporting. So I'd say to you that principles 1, 2 and 8 of the Press Council are well worth considering in your efforts to combat hate speech. Now, I have to say though, the Press Council only deals with newspapers. It doesn't deal with broadcasting, but I understand last week the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland spoke to you, so they will have covered that. And there's another significant weakness in the Press Council's remit, and that is we cannot cover the online publication in newspapers and magazines of comments by readers. The reason for that essentially is that by and large editors and publishers do not accept responsibility for the comments they post under their articles. And the reason they don't accept responsibility is that they're not moderated. You can go directly online with your comment without anybody, editor or journalist, between you and the commentary going up on air. So the editor's views essentially is that they are hosters of these comments rather than publishers of these comments. Now, you might think, surely that is the same as letters to the editor. So on the letters page in all our newspapers, there are letters there from readers. They are all moderated. Someone has looked at those and said, that's defamatory, that's racist, that's got hate speech, I'm not publishing it. But the online material, by and large, goes up directly. The exception to that, interestingly, in Ireland is the Independent Newspapers Group, which actually does moderate all comments which go up, and also take down all comments after 48 hours. But if you take the Journal, which is a member of the Press Council, or the Irish Times, or the Examiner, all of those will post comments directly to publication without anybody in between. And that's where you see a lot of comment which is racist, a lot of comment which is grossly exaggerating or grossly inaccurate. And it is a space where people with very extreme views can reach out to their audience. So it's a weakness of the Press Council that we cannot deal with that area. But it's a weakness which is common to most other press councils as well. Until it is clear that publishers are responsible for the commentary they post on their websites, this weakness is going to remain. And the other weakness is, and it's the elephant in the room here, is that most hate speech is found on social media. It's found on Twitter and it's found on Facebook. And one of the reasons why it's found there is because it is so easy to put anonymous commentary, anonymous viewpoints on Facebook and Twitter. You can so easily disguise who you are. The Irish Times has recently tried to address this by only allowing subscribers to comment. So if you go to the commentary under the Irish Times articles on their website now, there are very few comments. The numbers have reduced hugely, and the reason is they've said you have to be identifiable, you have to be a subscriber, because they were aware that people with multiple identities were using the commentary section to post quite offensive and racist and bigoted commentary. But if you look at the Journal, the Journal's journalism is subject to the Press Council. You can make a complaint about an article on the Journal, but you can't make a complaint about the commentary underneath. And if you look at the commentary underneath, it is so frequently full of anger and hatred and nastiness and ugliness about a whole range of subjects. And that is not subject to any press regulation. And indeed, the internet The benefits of the internet are unquestionable. They have provided every citizen with access to an infinitely greater amount of information than was available in pre-internet days. And also it provided freedom. And we can all think of examples of where the unregulated internet has been hugely important. An obvious example would be the Arab Spring, where authoritarian regimes wanted to stop protests taking place, but they had to compete with citizen journalists using their mobile phones and simply videoing demonstrations. So the official media could say, or not report demonstrations, but the truth was evident from the unregulated internet. But that unregulated internet is also where most of the dangerous material is to be found today. And there's a balance to be achieved, because you have to respect the importance of citizen journalists. You have to understand how vitally, in the interest of everybody, in public interest, is access to be able to express your viewpoints, and then balance that with the abuse of that. And in my view, and it's not an unusual view, by and large, social media organizations, Facebook, Twitter, have been terribly slow to face up to their responsibility. Now, they're beginning to do so. They're beginning to do so because of fear of statutory regulation. They're beginning to move into the area of kind of self-regulation, which is what the newspaper, the Press Council of Ireland is. And you now have, for example, Facebook saying they will put up a little pop-up on screen saying this article contains facts which fact checkers dispute. So up until now, you could say almost anything you liked on Facebook and no one challenged it. And we know what fake news is, and we know how detrimental it has been in the last decade. It is good to hear that Facebook are going to try and do something about it. But what's driving them more than anything else is the fear of regulation. So the German government now is proposing absolutely swinging fines to social media sites if they do not take down material which is inaccurate or which contains racism. They're talking about fines up to 50 million euros in some instances. Now, that's certainly going to make them consider it. But it is undoubtedly an area that we need to discuss, and that is that the majority of hate speech now occurs online. And it is an area which is largely unregulated, either self-regulated or regulated by governments. And that, it's an international sphere. It's not like newspapers which are published in a country or magazines which are published in a country. By and large, the internet exists out there in the iCloud somewhere. And it's terribly difficult. I'll give you a simple example of that. If you see something on Facebook which is inaccurate about yourself, it's extremely difficult to get Facebook to address that. Facebook actually, even though they have hundreds of employees within 2 miles of here, don't have a telephone number in the telephone book. They're terribly hard to contact. They're terribly hard to get them to take seriously their responsibility, not to allow their services to be abused and misused. Now, the last couple of years, you've seen signs of them beginning to address that, but it's still extremely difficult. And you as a citizen, you find yourself at a serious disadvantage because you're up against an enormously powerful, almost anonymous institution. It's terribly difficult to assert your rights. And where I see that, to bring it down to a very practical level, is if somebody dies, a road accident, what newspapers do now is they want a picture of that person who died. In the past, they would send their journalist out to the person's home who would respectfully knock on the door and explain, I'm a journalist, and we want to write an article about your son who was killed in a car crash. Could we have a photograph of him, please? And the family could decide yes or no. And if they decided yes, they would choose whatever photograph they wanted to give to the newspaper to publish the next day. What journalists do nowadays simply is they just go to Facebook and they find that person's Facebook page, and on that person's Facebook page will be 50 illustrations. And those 50 illustrations will be the dead person at his 21st birthday party, the dead girl at a New Year's Eve ball in great fun with a silly hat on her head, having a good time. And frequently now, half a dozen of those photographs will be published. And that causes huge pain to families because they are obviously respectful, they're hurt, they're respectful. They want something respectful shown of their daughter. They don't want a party photograph chosen. They don't want 6 or 8 photographs chosen. You may have seen in the last couple of weeks an Irish woman from Buncrana in County Donegal was murdered in India. And within 24 hours, within 12 hours, all the online news sites in Ireland had multiple photographs of her all taken off her Facebook page, without any request to anybody, is it appropriate to do so, have we got permission to do so, arguing that because it's on Facebook, therefore it is public property, there's no privacy rights. But in our code, we demand that journalists respect grieving families. Is that showing respect to a grieving family to publish inappropriate photographs? The same may be said of what is said. That poor woman in Goa who was murdered, before she was murdered, she was subject to a brutal attack. Several of our newspapers gave the most vivid description of the kind of attack she was subject to before she died. It's a difficult one to call, and you don't want the press council, the press ombudsman's office to be seen as a censor. We're there more than anything else to try to encourage standards, to try and get things better, get journalists to think about what they do. And I worked as a journalist for years and years, and I have to say, it's a very unreflective profession. It's driven by deadlines. What really counts in journalism is, when do I have to have this piece ready for? Do I have to have this piece ready for the 9 o'clock news? Do I have to have it ready for tomorrow? Do I have to have it ready for next week? It's not a very reflective process. There isn't time to reflect. And as soon as you have published or broadcast a piece, then you're on to the next piece. You actually don't have time to sit back and look at the last piece I published or the cumulative effect. That's why people like Aidan White are so valuable, because they can actually give you, journalists, that perspective to look at what is happening overall, what can be done overall. I'll leave you at that point, and I'm free to take any questions you like afterwards. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.